Numerous backrooms and liminal space games continue to have a monster present, but there is something inherently contradictory about an entity in the backrooms. The horror of the space is structural. It lives in the repetition, the silence, the absence of anything to rationalize the unease against. An entity violates it on arrival, but more than that, it commercializes it. Monsters drive games forward, yes, but they also become the face of the game. In this way, the fear has been made tangible enough to monetize, which is another way of saying it has been defanged. But you cannot commodify a corridor. You can only commodify what lives in it. And yet the counter-argument is not nothing. An entity you have seen is frightening. An entity you have not seen, but cannot rule out, is something closer to paranoia, which is a considerably more debilitating condition. The knowledge that something may be in the corridor does not dissolve the architectural dread. It adds to it. The silence is no longer merely wrong, it is suspicious. The repetition is no longer merely disorienting, it is potentially deliberate. Exit 8 understands this precisely. When you enter that corridor, the fear is derived not from the anomaly itself, but the paranoia of whether there is truly one present at all. The horror of Exit 8's game corridor is produced not by what the space contains, but by what it does to the person inside it. To appreciate how the game builds horror, let us strip back its layers. Its proportions are institutional, long enough that the far end remains unresolved, wide and tall enough to feel built for movement rather than habitation, so the body never fully settles. Its surfaces are uniformly smooth, stripped of its texture that encodes a space history of use, communicating that nothing has ever happened here and nothing ever will. The fluorescent lighting eliminates shadow entirely, flattening depth while triggering a low-level physiological unease the player cannot consciously identify. Total visibility with zero safety. And the sound design evacuates everything except the hum the brain was trained in ordinary life to ignore, forcing it into the foreground until players' own footsteps become the only proof of their existence in the space. When the anomalies arrive, waves where there should be none, footsteps that are not the player's own, the violation is not external. The game has spent its entire runtime training the player's pattern recognition against itself. The familiarity is the weapon. The horror was always the player being there. So the entity question does not resolve cleanly. It never did. But it does raise a question worth confronting. If the horror of these spaces depends so completely on the player's own presence inside them, what happens when you take the player out of the question entirely? What survives the translation from a space you inhabit to a space you merely watch?
Where the game distills the Exit 8 corridor to its purest architectural condition with no backstory, no character, no consequence beyond the loop itself. The film translates that same space into moral geography. The protagonist, only known as the Lost Man, whose name in its original character encodes the word test, is not simply navigating a horror environment. He is a man whose entire life is structured around the exit he never takes. He is running from his pregnant girlfriend, from the responsibilities accumulating around him, from the version of himself that would stay and face things. The film opens with him on a train, watching a man berate a woman and doing nothing. He steps off the train and into the corridor. In the original game, we are plunged straight into gameplay, and eventually the conclusion is as underwhelming as fading to white, setting the tone to half convince ourselves as if it never happened. What the game presents as a fever dream, the film recasts as purgatory, a space where you are held inside until you are ready to leave it differently than you arrived. The walking man, no longer a neutral anomaly, but a former subject who failed, who succumbed to Exit 8, functions as a warning made flesh. This is what the corridor does to people who mistake endurance for progress. The loop is not a horror mechanic here. It is a character flaw given geometry. One of the most focal additions to the film is the child the Lost Man encounters in the space, his own future child. A consequence he has not yet chosen to face made suddenly unbearably present. He is being asked to reckon with someone who does not yet exist. In this way, the corridor has been transformed into guilt-given architecture. When he finally reaches the exit, he finds himself back on the train, watching the same scene unfold with the man and woman. The film's revision of the game's central mechanic becomes complete. While the game's loop is escaped by learning the space, the film's loop is escaped by learning yourself. In the Exit 8 game, the horror is not something that arrives from outside the player. It is produced by the player's own pattern recognition turning against them. The game trains the player to read the corridor. Then the horror is the moment that trained reading detects something wrong, or worse, the inability to trust our own competence and be consumed by paranoia as we are sent back to Exit 0. No film can achieve this because film cannot condition the audience into specific, embodied readiness that makes the anomaly land. A viewer watching a flickering light in the horror film denotes this as generic horror gimmicks, a tangible category of cinematic threat. A player who has walked into Exit 8 corridor 20 times before brings something more intimate and more vulnerable, their own hard-earned knowledge of how the light should behave. This distinction points towards a broader theoretical claim about the medium specificity of interactive horror. Games like Exit 8 and the game iterations of the Backroom do not merely present liminal spaces for the player to observe. They construct conditions in which the player's own presence, their footsteps, their attention, their pattern recognition, their nervous system's involuntary response to fluorescent light, becomes the primary instrument of horror production. The space is not the source of dread, the player is. These games are defined by action rather than representation. The action that matters most, though, is not the avatar's movement through the space, but the player's perceptual and physiological engagement with it.
The Backrooms movie adaptation, however, participates in a broader tradition of horror cinema, in which architecture functions as an active participant rather than passive backdrop, a tradition most commonly associated with Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. The Overlook Hotel is not merely the setting for Jack Torrance's psychological dissolution, it is its catalyst and its mirror. The non-Euclidean geometry of the hotel, windows in interior rooms, a hedge maze that appears on the hotel's architectural blueprints, functions precisely as the Backrooms does. The architecture of the space and Clark's deteriorating mind are made to rhyme, then to converge, then to become indistinguishable. The Backrooms movie succeeds because they embrace this model explicitly. The non-Euclidean time of the backroom space, its capacity to disorient the protagonist's sense of duration, to make minutes feel like months and hours feel like seconds, aids the manic transformation of the protagonist in the same way that the Overlook's temporal distortions fuel Jack's. In both cases, the protagonist's attempt to regain control carry them further than where they began, and the space amplifies whatever psychological fault lines the character arrived with. In this way, the architecture is not passive, it is an active participant. Though this is not a straightforward loss from the game adaptations, what might initially seem to be a degradation of the original Backrooms thread is, in this reading, not a diminishment but a translation. The uncanny is still demonstrated, only not internalized within the player, but externalized onto the protagonist. We see it through the unification of the protagonist's psyche with its physical manifestation in the liminal space's architecture. And we, the audience, can witness this horror as it is rendered legible through their deterioration.
Liminal spaces were never designed to be a genre. They were cracking the surface of the familiar. The power is in the instability, in the fact that the feeling resisted definition, resisted commodification, resisted the kind of sustained attention that turns its sensation into a product. The moment you name a thing, you degrade the very essence it had that drew you in. You have, by this point in the video, watched breakdowns of XAA and the Backrooms. You have followed the mechanism of internalized fear, architectural dread, the translation of interactivity into cinema. You have, in other words, participated in exactly the process this video has been describing. The empty liminal theater we yearn for was always bound to fill up. This is not an accusation. It is an observation about the particular condition of contemporary dread. People are not simply consuming liminal horror anymore, they are manufacturing it, boarding peaceful games into unsettling ones, constructing backroom levels in engines designed for something else entirely, filming empty shopping centers at closing times and uploading them to platforms optimized for engagement. The aesthetications of liminal spaces is no longer something that happens to them. It is something that we do, collectively, continuously, in spaces that were supposed to feel safe from exactly this kind of attention. What begun as a JPEG on a forum is now a cinematic genre. Each of these translations removes something, and what is removed, cumulatively, is the very instability that made the whole thing evoke these unnameable feelings in the first place.